Welcome to this Decolonizing Economics Summit session on the media's role in decolonization. I'm Steve Dubb. I'm Senior Editor of Economic Justice and Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. In this session, we hope to delve deeply into the world of media as a tool for decolonization. As you know, media shapes our lives and worldviews and often is a tool for colonization. It tells us what products to buy, what to think about, and what is quote unquote important. Media informs us as to the scope of what is quote unquote realistic or possible. And in this age of corporate media consolidation, building a people's media or community media is critical for building the movement that we need to decolonize and democratize our economy. To discuss these vital questions, we're joined by four amazing leaders in this democratic media space. These are Llewellyn Schmitt of KMUD Radio, Tom Llewellyn of Shareable, Vincent Schilling of Native Viewpoint, and Jourdan Bennet-Begaye of Indian Country Today, also known as ICT. One other note, we're very excited to take your questions. We will start with our own and then get to yours. Please enter your questions into the chat and I will do my level best as moderator to make note of them. We want to dedicate at least the last 30 minutes of this session to your questions. And with that, we'll begin with Llewellyn. And Llewellyn, if you can introduce yourself in more detail and perhaps talk a little bit about your role at KMUD Radio.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And good afternoon to our listeners and to our viewers. I am humbled and honored to have been included on today's summit and decolonizing media panel with our esteemed panelists. I work for Redwood Community Radio in Northern California. Our station is located on stolen Wailaki land, and we broadcast to the ancestral territory of Karuk, Yurok, Hoopa, Wiyot, Mattole, Wailaki, Wintu, Sinkyone, Pomo, Lassic, and Yuki peoples, now known as Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties. 10 years ago, if you would have told me that I would be the news director here at KMUD, I wouldn't have believed you and I would have probably laughed. I initially got involved in 2016 as a volunteer engineer and programmer. But what would unfold in 2017 would really change the trajectory of my entire life and career. Many of us remember Standing Rock and the fight to protect Indigenous rights, water, and land. As tensions escalated on the ground, a friend and I began networking and speaking with folks who were there, putting their bodies on the line, and we created a weekly talk show, the Standing Rock Report. Featuring those live voices and updates from water protectors. When Indigenous leaders told us that a dozen law enforcement officials turned in their badges because they refused to attack non-violent people who were protesting with prayer, it was just an extremely powerful moment. And that was when I realized the power of radio and the power of community journalism. Later that year in 2017, white supremacists gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was engineering a show when a friend and freelance journalist called in live to KMUD to share their account of what unfolded, sharing the details of that horrific scene, like the police not only, not helping people, but also participating in that violence. I would later go on to file my first news story with that audio and have been working with KMUD Radio ever since. And I have the pleasure to serve our community as their news director and continue to elevate voices for justice. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Llewellyn. Tom, could you introduce yourself and talk about the work of Shareable?
Yeah, so I'm Tom Llewellyn. I'm joining you from formerly and actually current Amamutsan land in what's known as the Santa Cruz Mountains, where I share utilities with the Amamutsan tribe. And as was mentioned, I'm with Shareable. I'm the interim executive director. I've been with the organization for about 9 years now. And the organization is, Shareable is kind of focused on catalytic solutions journalism. essentially telling stories of work that's happening on the ground and empowering those that are reading those stories and engaging with that content to replicate them, to adapt them, to take action in their own communities. And we've always felt that there is no such thing as unbiased coverage. And we instead wear our biases on our sleeves and are as transparent about our beliefs and what's behind our reporting as possible. And I, personally have been really came to this kind of journalism storytelling work not as a journalist, but really more as a community organizer, and knowing that it's the battle of the story is real, and the importance of narrative storytelling within all of our movement work is key to our success, to be able to broaden our coalitions and to be able to achieve our goals. And so that's how I got into kind of media work. And now 9 years later, we are in the middle of kind of a pivot where we're shifting from as really focusing on the storytelling to the empowering of action and being an enabling organization. And so continuing to tell specific stories, but also realizing that so many of the things that we started publishing about in 2009 have either become mainstream or larger publications have picked up those beats. And now it's that same type of work is not as necessary as it was before. And we're continuing to pivot. And so that includes, the kind of diving into doing more how-to type content, explainers, which we have published on Shareable recently about how to give the land back, about how to, we've got a piece recently that was published that's on our homepage from Sustainable Economies Law Center about which are legal tools for land return, and really focusing on the kind of nuts and bolts of being able to do this work in our communities.
Great, thanks, Tom. That was amazing. Vince, could you introduce yourself and talk about Native Viewpoint?
Sure, absolutely. Sego Jogaliskiga. My name is Vincent Schilling, and I am a Native American journalist and author. And I've been writing a book with under contract with Random House Penguin Books residential schools. And I formed my own site, Native Viewpoint, which was kind of a place where I could just kind of post my musings about things. And I'm a proud former colleague of Jourdan Bennet-Begaye, who's editor of ICT. I used to work with ICT for many, many years and did some incredible content there, and really proud to have shared some of those times with her. And, as a Native American journalist and author, as well as a person who's pretty entrenched in social media and bringing voice to Indigenous people, I think that this world has been an exciting one in terms of the past generation, in terms of the voiceless have gotten their voice in so many ways. And I feel like Native journalists, as well as Indigenous journalists, as well as Indigenous people, as well as people of color and journalists of color, have done a lot to bring a lot of these issues to the forefront, and it's exciting times, to be in this position. And I can't imagine this world this way when I was in high school back in 1985 during the time of Duran and Frankie Goes to Hollywood, thinking of today, where we are, and looking back, it's just an incredible place. I didn't even have a cell phone when I was in college, and now here we are with so many things going on. So it's exciting times, and I'm very honored to have been invited, Steve, and to be here with Tom, Lauren, and Jourdan, and the rest of you. There's been some really wonderful things that have been going on, and it's great to be a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Vince. I also want to, last but not least, Jourdan, I want to give you the floor and to introduce yourself and ICT.
Hi everyone. Yeah, she Jourdan Bennet-Begaye and she Ani ma dashkiji bashachi nakadane dashache oze tachini dashanella. I'm Jourdan Bennet-Begaye. I'm Dene, also known as Navajo, but the Spanish gave us that name, so I prefer Dene. So I am based in Washington, D.C. at one of our bureaus for ICT. I'm the editor and have been since January 2022. I'm the first woman to be in this role and as chief news executive. So I think that in itself is, one of the definitions of decolonizing media, which I think is pretty cool. And I've been with the organization for about 5 years since it was revived by my mentor and predecessor, Mark Trahant. Just a little bit about ICT's history. We are 40, actually turning 42 this year. At 42 years old, we were started by Tim Gallego, who passed away last summer. We started out as Lakota Times up in South Dakota, and he changed the name to cover Indigenous issues nationally and in the 90s. And then he sold it to the United Nation of New York. And then they turned it into a magazine and started to publish it online. And it got a little too expensive for them. So they gifted Indian Country Today to the National Congress of American Indians. And so that's where they hired Mark, and he revived it. I was Mark, Vincent, and I there just trying to post one story a day. So that was the goal, and it's just really remarkable to see how much we've grown today. We have a staff of about 30 people with business, digital, and broadcast. We have our headquarters in Phoenix, Arizona. We partnered with Arizona State University, and we have 2 bureaus, one at Cronkeik's DC campus, and then we have another partnership with Alaska Pacific University in Anchorage, Alaska, and we have a reporter there. And actually next week, you guys are going to hear it because we're going to announce our 3rd bureau opening in Missoula, Montana, because we're partnering with the University of Montana School of Journalism. And it's part of our 3-year project to open 7 more bureaus, giving a total of 9 bureaus across the country, and to really create a pathway or a gateway for young people to start their careers in media. So we're really thrilled and excited by that. And we, of course, have a digital component, so we're all online. We have about 5.5, maybe 6 million readership on there. And during the pandemic, we saw a need for, to get the word out about COVID to our communities by TV, Zoom, and then by tribal radio stations, because people wanted to know what was happening in their communities, but across the country, what does that look like? So our broadcast that was set to start that fall of 2020 ended up starting in our living rooms in the spring and kind of turned from a weekly show to a daily. And now we have an incredible broadcast team who brings a half-hour show every day, and I'm just blown away and impressed by them. But that's who we are. We have a national internship program that's launching this summer, and we cover the Indigenous world from the local level, from the tribal level, all the way onto global, and we have partnerships in between to get that done.
Thanks, and I appreciate you sharing the story about ICT's history. I mean, I think when I first started Nonprofit Quarterly in September of 2017, I was writing about the shutdown of ICT and lamenting that, and it's just been amazing to see it, the rebirth and then growth, and become something that it never was. So congratulations, it's really great.
Thanks.
And I know Vince played a role in that too, a big role.
Yeah.
But I want to start with some of our questions for the panel, and let's start with the topic. Can you discuss how the media is currently colonized, and what is the role of democratic or community media in decolonization, and how do you fit into that from your own organizations? And anyone can jump in first, and we'll just flow from there.
Well, I'll start by saying I think the first thing you have to do is and address is what is colonization. And and I think people know broadly what it is, but colonization is essentially when a foreign power has sought and then obtains control over an existing entity. And this foreign power then asserts its beliefs and teachings, while synonymously dismantling the culture and beliefs of the entity or people on which it wishes to reside and rule. So that said, how does media assert such an existence or ruling influence or dominance? And the answer to that is by maintaining control of these formerly taught, or let's say newly introduced issues. In this case, it's been the controlling force. And in the case of the United States, so to speak, as the majority of white, male, patriarchal beliefs. Some might even say the founding fathers. And these same white males have dominated, established, and created a system based on histories they originally created and introduced. As many of us have heard, those who wrote history are the victors of war. So anything that maintains this original system, and in this case, this patriarchy, is in fact a colonized system. So how is media currently colonized? It's because media platforms for many generations, which have been run by these overseers, are the ones responsible for maintaining a system of information, or in some cases, disinformation. And how do you keep people confined to the system? By controlling the information they receive. This control of information for so long is losing its ability. It's bursting at the seams, literally, because cell phones, smartphones, laptops, computers, Google, Bard, ChatGPT, all of these things that people can do to get information now is essentially dismantling these large organizations that once held control and once held power. TikTok is teaching. I heard a guy on social media the other day said, you know what, I went to school for years and never learned anything, but I learned something on TikTok every day. So that's what they're up against. So media is colonized because it's trying to still hold on to these old ideas of control, but it's losing. It's a losing battle, whether they want to admit it or not. So that's my opinion, so to speak, or my view.
That's great. Thanks, Vince. Let's see, Lauren, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I kind of want to start with the latter portion of that question, because I work for the KMUD newsroom, which is an autonomous branch of our radio station, but our values reflect that of our station. For instance, our mission is to envision a community of listeners who work together to create a better, more just, and sustainable world systems to ensure that all human and other living species on Earth can move forward together with higher quality of life and are able to survive the challenges and the times ahead. I believe our vision statement embodies decolonization. Some of our listeners may be familiar with the chair of Cal Poly Humboldt's Native American Studies, Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy, a member of the Hupa Yurok-Karuk tribes. And in a virtual conference, she stated that to move past the climate crisis, we need to dismantle settler colonialism, a view that the world is here for profit, right? A symptom of capitalism. And in our newsroom, we address these issues by elevating voices and, as an example, covering the fight of Indigenous forest defenders to protect their sacred lands, from Strawberry Rock in Humboldt County to the Jackson Demonstration State Forest in Mendocino, where those lands currently face clear cuts from timber conglomerates who own more land collectively than anyone else in our region, a historic disjustice. in our reporting, that's how we frame these stories. And we try to report on what a decolonized future can be, like land back, which really is a movement, not a metaphor. And we have seen that reciprocity in action locally, and are honored to bring those stories to a larger audience. But I think the role for media is to reporting on how it can be a reality. To channel Dr. Kutchi again, she says for most folks, it's easier to imagine a zombie apocalypse than a world without capitalism. And to do so, I think media, we need to do due diligence to avoid the echo chamber that reinforce, these pre-existing beliefs, like we spoke earlier, using the term of free market, right? So we need to be careful in how we use our language and work together collaboratively.
Thanks. I don't know. Jourdan, do you want to jump in at all on this?
Yeah. I kept listening to Lauren and Vince. I'm like, oh, there's so many ways. I think the number one thing is, I think more news, the way that they can decolonize, or at least media can, is hiring more Indigenous journalists, because people kept saying they can't find any, and the truth is ICT has hired more Native journalists than ever, and that's just our news are just full of talent, from the business side all the way to like broadcast and in between. And I think it's really important to have Indigenous journalists in these spaces and having that support, not only from their supervisors, but also resources too, having and accepting pitches and knowing that, just because a story, I just think of when I was in grad school up in Syracuse. I was interning up there, and I wanted to pitch Standing Rock, and they didn't take it, and and it became like a global story, and nobody listened to me, how it was such an important story. And it frustrated me after the fact that, and I knew back then, this was like in 2016, that I did not want to go into mainstream media, because I dealt with that for about a few months, and I was not going to do that the rest of my life. So I really tried to find spaces where my voice is valued and I'm respected, and I'm also trusted, because I have, and we have as Indigenous journalists, a responsibility to tell these stories, because people entrust us with this valuable information they have. And beyond that, a lot of hiring Indigenous journalists just as reporters, as newsroom leaders, is also another thing I advocate for, is having Native people as newsroom leaders or in those leadership positions, because those are the decisions are being made. Reporters are great, but the people making decisions come from the top, not from the bottom. And so I'm a huge advocate for getting Native folks in those leadership positions. And it all just comes together, like the context. That's what Native journalists bring, nuances when pitching stories. And I'm more looking like more forward thinking rather than thinking how it's done in the past. We all know it's been terrible. We all know that, American society, even like on dominant societies, hold Native people in, caricatures from way in the past, and that were savages and uncivilized. We've heard the whole bit. So I'm more of like looking at this and forward thinking, and what are those actionable, where actions can come from this. And how can we, reframe it and hold not only ourselves accountable, but each other as well. And when you think about it too, one thing when we do, I'm a board member of NAJA, the Native American Journalists Association, and we do a lot of newsroom trainings. And one point I like to bring to all of these newsrooms is that Native people have been storytellers or journalists our entire lives, this time in millennia. The first tribal newspaper in the country was the Cherokee Phoenix, and it was founded about 50 years before the Washington Post and the New York Times. And there are tons of works of art documenting, these interactions between settlers and Native people across the country. It's there. And so that's journalism right there. wasn't something white men created. It's always been done. And the first tribal newspaper, again, was done before these other legacy media. So that's just how, forward thinking, I'm looking at it.
Hey, Jourdan, for someone who said she didn't want to go into mainstream media, I think you hit that one out of the park.
Yeah.
Well, I can go on to Tom. I don't know if you want to jump in this question, or I can go on to the next question.
You can go to the next one. It's all right.
Okay. Yeah. So what does it mean for media to be an ally to local communities? And Tom, maybe you should start that one just because. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just be really brief on this one, but I think that, one of the key things is the respect for community voices and community needs. And I think that's something that we at Shareable have really tried to do our best. We are an international publication, and we have staff that's distributed around the United States and writers that are distributed around the world, but we're not in the majority of the places that we are covering. And so there's a responsibility as publishers and as journalists to not just helicopter in, not just accept a single perspective, but to really prioritize that type of relationship building with the communities that we're covering through doing a lot of listening and snowballing. Who else should we talk to? And we've especially this comes up when we've got a program which kind of looks at the ways that communities come together in the face of disasters to build collective resilience. And so we take a lot of care when engaging with communities that have experienced traumas, that have experienced historical traumas, to provide the space and the time to be able to get those stories and then be very protective of those stories and make sure that the way that we're telling those stories is not exploitative. It's not exploitive. It's not specifically directed at as one of these questions which has just come up in the chat around attention farming communications, and is really supportive to the work that's then happening on the ground. And that's kind of what our perspective always is at Shareable, is that whatever kind of community support we're doing is that the media is needed, the stories are being asked to be told, and then we steward them the best that we can.
Great. Lauren, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and for those watching, you can probably assume, but for those listening, I'm non-native, I'm a white millennial. So I would like to just recognize that my life experience reflects that. But in the newsroom, I'm very proud to say that over the last few years, we've taken a strong initiative to train Native and other BIPOC journalists, community journalists who are now a part of our news team and reflect that as a whole, not just in our newsroom, but throughout our entire programming, which KMUD as an entity itself identifies as an ally. Kind of going on what Tom said, I think it's really important as an ally to also recognize that sometimes you need to step back, which is my favorite thing about my media, radio, because it's their voices, not mine. So we get to step back and bring voice to folks as an ally, as a partner.
Great. Vince?
Yeah. So what does it mean for media to be an ally to their communities? For me, for one thing, media outlets can start by not ignoring those local communities. That happens a lot, particularly these communities of color. These media organizations can also strive to avoid pigeonholing these people in terms of having one perspective. And I can speak from my experience as a Native American. I'm always busiest during November, Native American Heritage Month, Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day, or Thanksgiving, to talk about my views on Native issues. There was comedian Charlie Hill, I remember this, Jourdan, where he says, "Hey, look, I'm here. I'm in front of all you people. It's not even November." So,
yeah.
and so I mean, this is one of the reasons why I became a critic for Rotten Tomatoes. For example, I still get asked why I review films that are not Native American based. I mean, for me, I mean, I love the latest John Wick movie, but media outlets don't necessarily reach out for my opinion as a Native critic, as opposed to reaching out to me for a Native American themed film. So to answer the question directly, I could say as a media person, you should always, work on building your list of contacts and sources, and especially as an Indigenous person, or if you have a contact that is an Indigenous person, remember that you can also ask me to be a source for non-Indigenous issues. There's nothing wrong with calling on experts to comment on their fields of expertise, but there's many times an Indigenous journalist or professional can serve to inform on a vast range of topics. I don't always have to talk about Columbus. You know what I'm saying? It's just a perspective to hold that, if there's a Viewpoint show or a show where you need a journalist, just a journalist, literally someone who's got media experience. What happens oftentimes is who's chosen is someone who's not of color. And, and it could easily be anyone. So I'm just saying, keeping your mind open is a great way to be an ally to your community.
Thanks. Jourdan, did you want to jump in here?
These guys said it all. Like I said, I'm sticking to my guns and just hiring folks. But I really like Vincent's his point on pigeonholing too, because I mean that's the thing. Like we don't just like stuff that are Native related or Indigenous related. There's a bunch of cool things happen out there, and other people non-Native or Native who inspire us and who inspire our communities as well.
Great, thanks. Well, I wanted to next ask a question. How do community media address the shortfalls of traditional commercial media, which of course are enormous? So there's a lot there, and anybody can jump in.
Well, I think community media is connected to its reader base in a much more or viewer base in a much more intimate way, because they know their audience. They can more appropriately address the needs of their community by giving them information they seek or need without demeaning them or talking down to them because they don't have the experience. Sometimes mainstream media outlets, the type of reporting they do when they need to have considerations regarding racial sensitivities or racial bias are often hurtful without necessarily meaning to be. In addition, larger media organizations do what I call shotgun reporting. They put out a story with little regard for the fallout. They also seldom maintain their social media platforms. When someone has an opinion and voice their opinion on social media, and then they get accosted or bullied, these larger organizations don't come to the aid of people who have these opinions, and they tend to just stick with, well, that's our story, too darn bad, get over it. I think that community-based media really has the ability to cater to their audience in a nice way, and that's why these organizations usually fare a little better in terms of doing things that are friendlier. And what's happening as because of this is larger organizations are seeing these smaller organizations are doing things that their local community enjoys, and the stories ended up getting uplifted or brought into the mainstream or so.
Great, thanks. Lauren, you're at a community radio station, so I imagine you have some things to say about this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot. Everyone's been saying such amazing stuff. I just, again, really appreciate being here. Well, one of the things that really first comes to mind when I read this question was addressing the disproportionate media representation of the MMIP crisis, missing and murdered Indigenous people, a crisis that affects every Native person across this country. Locally, the Yurok tribe and the Sovereign Bodies Institute have created a database of all these cases. When I first got into this newsroom and started reporting on this, I realized that they are the only people that have this data set, which I mean, flabbergasted, I don't think is even the right word, but it highlights that failure of our government. And we call it as it is. It's a failure of our government. It's a failure, systemic failure. But thinking about how the traditional shortfalls, when we cover these failures, there's also things worth celebrating, right? Celebrating that the Yurok tribe has created a pathway and plan of action to address this crisis and are moving forward. It's just when we see the statistics of MMIP cases and compare it to media coverage, there is a problem. And I think it's something that all BIPOC communities face when it comes to national or corporate outlets. When white people go missing, there is an extraordinary increase of coverage. I mean, thinking of the tragic case of Gabby Petito. I mean, her murder, which of course is absolutely tragic, but it was all we saw on national outlets for weeks. And I have yet to see a similar response for a non-white individual. And that's something we work to address here locally on KMUD. There's many families still seeking justice, and we elevate their voice and try to hold local officials accountable. Again, I want to say it's not all tragic. When Vincent's saying, don't just call us on Thanksgiving to talk about the tragedies and our opinions on it. There's so much more to celebrate that needs to be covered. I mean, locally, we have multiple tribes revitalizing traditional ceremonies after 150 years, of colonization. And I really think it's important for media to call things what they are. We had a planning commissioner recently use a racial slur at a public meeting. And, I heard a television station locally say, oh, the off-colored remark. No, it's racist and wrong. And that's what it is. And that's how we refer to it. We're not going to give them a pass. So I think it's super important to call things for what they are. And also just speaking to KMUD, I know during local emergencies, we recently had multiple earthquakes and unprecedented snowstorms in our region. And when you think about the media, we had multiple national outlets come here to cover the tragedies and try to get that headline and that soundbite. But with local media, we're working to get the stories that matter to our community, that inform and can save lives instead of entertain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Lauren, I just want to follow up briefly. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how KMUD has covered land recovery efforts and with the Yurok and so forth. I think that would be a good story to share here.
Yeah, absolutely. Tuluwat was recently returned to the Wiyot people, which is kind of considered the birthing point of the land back movement. And when I was referring to some of the racist comments made by a planning commissioner, similar things occurred during that time when the city of Eureka came back into possession of Tuluwat, which is for Wiyot folks considered the center of the world, the center of the universe, where they hold their world renewal ceremony. Unfortunately, over 100 years ago, homicidal colonizers committed extreme atrocities. And I like to use the term attempted genocide, because when we say genocide, that gives people the impression that people were wiped out in entirety, which is not the case at all. We have a lot of thriving tribal communities here. But when the city of Eureka gave back to Uluwat, it was such an amazing celebration, and we're continuing to see more land back movements to this day. Members of the Wailaki tribe are also returning to their ancestral land, and there's been a vested interest from private landowners to return land back to tribal people. Again, really shout out to Ted Hernandez, the chairman of the Wiyot tribe. They're currently working on a document on how to assist other tribes through this process. So again, land back isn't an idea. It's not a hashtag. It is absolutely a movement. We actually had our first land back symposium hosted by the Yurok tribe with Wiyot people just last month, talking about, what those steps are, what that looks like, and how other tribes can be empowered to also have their land returned.
Great, thanks. So I want to move on to a question, so it sort of follows on this issue of accountability, and what are effective strategies that community media can use to promote economic justice and hold local officials accountable, and if possible, if you can give an example from your own publication of where that was done and how that works, so that it gets as concrete and specific as possible. And Tom, I'll throw it to you first, and then Jourdan, and we'll get others into this as well.
Yeah, thank you. So a number of years ago, we put together a kind of compendium of kind of model policies and community case studies of the ways that the cities kind of were working with people to meet the core city needs around housing and food and waste and water in their cities. And we looked at, I think, 137 different examples from over 80 cities and 35 countries. And as part of the release of that, we did a global book tour, and everybody that was involved. I think we had 25 organizations that submitted case studies and model policies. And one of the things that we specifically designed was into the book was that the model policies were short. They were a page or less, that they could be photocopied and brought into a city council meeting and said, hey, this thing is working in X city. We want to try it in this one. And one of the best examples of how that worked was I was in Fort Collins, Colorado, giving a presentation at the university, and a number of the students left the university and went to their city council meeting that night and wanted to advocate for participatory budgeting, so increasing the collective governance around how funds were being distributed in the city. And it just so happened that I had a meeting scheduled with city officials the next day while I was in town, and multiple city officials came up and said, hey, we heard about this thing. They left your talk. They came in, and what do we need to do? How do we move this forward? And so it just really kind of speaks to the importance of making whatever media we're creating as accessible and as useful as possible. And that there's, that's one example, but there's many other examples of where that book was used by different community organizers to advocate for change in their cities. And we're able to see that through. And Fort Collins now has a participatory budgeting program, which partially came out of that. So I think that's a direct example from our work at Shareable.
Great, thanks. Jourdan, any stories you want to give of where ICT has been uncovering local malfeasance and addressing it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there's two parts to this too. I think when we think of economic justice, we look outwards into the community, but also that's also looking at us as media organizations and entities and holding ourselves accountable. So one, to that, we pay a higher salary to all of our employees because they deserve that, and we don't want them. It's one less thing for them to worry about, and that's just number one. So the second part is we've done a couple of big projects. The Institute for Nonprofit News is one where we collaborate with other Indigenous media or Indigenous journalists and other orgs. And we did focus on rural economics in Indigenous communities. And that was done earlier in 2022. So just last year. Another project that Mark Trahan's been working on is his Indigenous Economics project, and that's a topic that hasn't really been explored deeply. So he's been doing a great job of that since 2022 as well. The one interesting story that came from the ongoing series, is he looked at the representation of Indigenous folks who are on corporate boards. And I can't remember the percentage, but it's very low. But when he looked at an industry in gaming, for example, gaming, and looking at Indian gaming brings in, I think, makes up most of the entire gaming industry in terms of money. But yet there's no Native person that sits on non-Indian gaming boards, which is just kind of like incredible to see. And I think he's following up on this story, but I mean, those are two, I guess, examples of like we've been looking at in terms of economic justice and just looking at the landscape of it too.
Great, thanks. Vince, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a fantastic report by Mark, by the way, Jourdan. Make sure to share that with him. That's incredible. You know, an effective strategy is simply reporting the truth, you know, and a lot of times, you know, that alone is, you know, enough to garner interest, you know, and, you know, in terms of media promoting economic justice and holding officials responsible, you know, in Native Viewpoint, I did a story on a Georgia school who asked a homework question to its students saying, you know, how did Andrew Jackson's removal of the Cherokee people actually help the United States grow and prosper? You know, and people were like, what? You know, so there is a sense of wanting to immediately just, you know, slam the school and cut them down and be like, how could you? But I approached it in a sense of, you know, let's try and grow and learn from this. So I contacted them directly. We had some good discussions, and, you know, they apologized and said, hey, you know what, that's not appropriate. And it became a positive thing, a positive solution. And, you know, they addressed the issue, changed the question, and thought of it in a different way, in a way that was much more constructive, you know, because, you know, of the removal of people, you know, yes, of course, anybody could be like, well, let's think of the positive of anything in the world, you know what I'm saying? But the way they went about it was not sensitive, you know. So media platforms overall, you know, have this responsibility, you know, but the larger ones, you know, because community media is becoming very, very influential. And whether or not they want to admit it, the larger media platforms are becoming less and less authoritative every day, because social media platforms, the voices of the masses, are becoming the voices that exist for change. You know, I mean, whether these large media platforms want to admit it or not, such as, you know, New York Times, Washington Post, whatever, you know, a trending hashtag can sometimes incite more change than a cover story in the New York Times. So, you know, to make sure that these communities of color and Indigenous journalists and so forth are being heard, you know, these larger organizations need to take heed to the work that they're doing, because these are the voices, you know, like they say, the meek shall inherit the earth. And I think media is doing just that.
Thanks, Vince. Lauren, I want to give you a shot. If there was any stories you wanted to talk about where, you know, a story that KMUD did that advanced, you know, racial and economic justice, or uncovered local corruption or anything of that sort.
You know, one of the things I wish I would have mentioned when you asked about the Wiyot land return is one of, you know, the persons who was fighting against it. We were able to track down that they are likely related to one of the persons that led the attempted genocide initially against Wiyot people. And now 4 generations later, this descendant, it was still trying to prevent this land back return. And I think a lot of what we do at KMUD, kind of like what Vincent said, is just sharing the truth. And yes, sometimes the truth can be extremely uncomfortable. Living in rural Northern California, you know, we have multiple generations of Native and non-Native people. And when you see who owns land and who doesn't, it's extremely blatant of what has happened here. And 2 years ago, when the Bear River Rancheria held their salmon ceremony for the first time in 120 years, there was a really healing moment we were allowed to be a part of and document, where young Bear River teenagers, you know, a 16-year-old boy was having a conversation with a 6th generation rancher. Their conversation was so candid. You know, the young 16-year-old was explaining to the rancher, you know, your great granddaddy would have tried to kill me and would have gotten paid by our government to do so. And I again, being able to just be there, hold my microphone, and being able to record this exchange with that rancher, apologizing to that young man for what, you know, he didn't do, but for what his ancestors did to this young man's ancestors, was such a powerful movement on top of an already powerful ceremony. One of the things I think that we are trying to promote on our airwaves, and something that David Cobb, one of the organizers of this summit, can probably speak to more, is a voluntary land tax. Because I mean, if you look around, and I think people are starting to understand that economic justice is long overdue, and people are looking for solutions. This is a great way to begin that conversation. And many folks who live on Wiyot land are now participating in a voluntary land.
You said voluntary land, Lauren. That's where you got cut.
A voluntary land tax, much like someone would do for, you know, the county or something like that. So those conversations are finally happening, and we're really excited and honored to be an outlet covering that.
Great, thanks. So I want to move on to 1 or 2 more questions, and there's a lot of questions from the audience, so I want to get to those as well. But, you know, one thing, I'm going to throw this to you, Vince, first, I think, but, you know,
Okay.
Community media is changing the way that stories are sourced. And in fact, technology, as you pointed out, is changing the way that stories are sourced, cell phones and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does citizen-based journalism look and feel like?
Yeah, you know, this was interesting to me because I had to really think about it, because there's so many different ways it can look, you know. I mean, first of all, community media, you know, is many times doing something simple yet critical, which is going directly to the community affected in order to obtain a story. You know, and I keep bringing this point up, but many times larger media organizations are disconnected from the community on which they're reporting. So they frankly have much less connectivity to the community and often rely on less informed sources or self-proclaimed experts to deliver their stories. So that said, citizen-based journalism, in my view, often tells stories with a bit more accuracy and insider viewpoint because they're closer to their source. But that can be a double-edged sword, because this said, citizen-based journalism does have a responsibility, at least in my view, to maintain a position of non-bias, which isn't always easy because, again, you're close to your source. So if you see a mother, you know, struggling with her family, it's not going to be very easy to be non-biased in your story, but it's very important, in my view, to maintain a position of non-bias whenever possible, you know, and this is in order to fight against sources that might try to discredit you. Because if I'm coming at you with an opinion, people can be like, that's just how you feel. But if I'm coming at you with, well, look, I'm reporting as a reporter, then that's what happened. So I think it's almost like, kind of going in there with a personal perspective as opposed to this grandiose perspective. And that's how I view citizen-based journalism to be, for me.
Thanks, Vince. Lauren, do you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, as far as the current state, I mean, to go on the other side of the coin there for what Vincent is saying, I think just media in general, we're seeing a big shift, right? As a lot of people are taking to their smartphones and social media, it's amazing. But on the other side of that coin, I also think it's under attack. We're seeing community outlets dissolving and being bought and consolidated by major corporations. And an example locally is our Eureka-based newspaper was in 2016 purchased by a major hedge fund out of Manhattan. I actually had a friend working for the publication at the time, and when this hedge fund purchased it, they cut staff in half, and with it, the wages. So now that publication isn't providing that same level of local news as before, and we're starting to see a shift in the topics they're reporting on. And it's not just in Eureka that this group, I'll say it, Alden Global Capital, has purchased newsrooms across the country and is doing the very same thing. But again, with that, we are seeing people take to community journalism. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter movement really blossomed because of this. We are able to share real-time information and injustices to a global audience. And I think it's amazing. Here at KMUD, we're facing a current challenge of funding. We rely on grants, but mostly community support. We had a membership drive, and we actually saw less donors than usual, except the amounts they donated were above average. And trying to make sense of that is, I think a lot of people are now used to getting their news for free. You go to a website, you read the article, but it wasn't actually free. You paid with it, with your data, with your personal information. And I understand people, online publications, we need to pay our journalists, and that is sometimes a way by using information. But with KMUD, I think a lot of our community members understand that this is a extremely important source of news and kind of the last of the last, holding it down. And I think people who did donate decided to double down with their support. I don't want to bleed into the next question, but I think really educating news consumers is important, and letting them know how they can support. And as Vincent said, we are seeing a lot of new grassroots media pop up, and I think it's breathing new hope into the future of news.
Great, thanks. And I'm gonna skip over questions because we're running out of time, but I did want to ask, I think I'll start with Jourdan on this question about, what is the ecosystem of support that enables media like ICT to thrive, and how do you economically support the work? And there's been a very, it's a very interesting business model that's been developed, and I think it'd be good for you to share it, and then for others to talk about how they sustain the work.
Yeah, and it kind of relates to Lauren's point too, in where a lot of these smaller newspapers are being bought out. I mean, I instantly thought of my hometown in Farmington, New Mexico. The Daily Times there was bought up by Gannett, and now there's only 2 reporters there. When I interned there almost 10 years ago, there was probably about 12, 15 staff members. So it's starting to create these news deserts there. But on the flip side of that, I think what's really helped community media thrive, and at least I've witnessed it with ICT, is a lot of content sharing and collaboration. with other newsrooms. I mean, we just finished, we're currently now collaborating, actually for the past 2 years, collaborated with High Country News, Manga Bay News, and Grist, covering the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. And we, collaborate with a couple outlets in Canada, APTN and CBC Indigenous, on covering different issues north of the medicine line. And, that I think that's, ICT has always just been about collaborating with other folks, other Native journalists, other Indigenous news outlets, even non-Native news outlets too, who see the work that we do. And it's really paid off. And I feel like that's putting our name out there is also why we've grown so much. And then right when, I think maybe 2 years ago, is when Mark and our CEO, Karen, decided to make, ICT a nonprofit. I think it was right before, I think the Salt Lake Tribune made themselves a nonprofit and announced it, because we saw, this was a viable, it was just gonna be viable and sustainable for us for long term, because that's our goal, is to make sure we don't fold again in a few years, but keep growing and growing, where other media organizations have been shrinking or laying off or furloughs or what have you. So a lot of our, I guess, model is, of course, getting donations from big and small funders. The thing that makes me just shed, the things that makes me shed a tear is, a lot of readers find ICT very valuable, so much that they take time to, go to the post office, go to the bank and get a money order and send it off to us. And it's $35. And that, I think of that, that could have been my auntie, my grandma, or somebody in our newsroom, their relative, because they believe in us that much and the work we do in serving them, because we're a public service. We do advertising as well, digitally, broadcasts, newsletters are also another. We have, different forms that we're still working on, but those are the main ones, at least for us, that economically support our work. And again, small donations are the ones that go a long way, in my opinion.
Great, thanks, Jourdan. So I'm going to start moving to audience questions because we said we'd do that. And I'll start. This is a provocative question, I thought. I won't read the preamble, but it asks, to what extent is media intelligence gathering for those in kinship against the plantation industrial mindset? And how do you, if you accept that premise that media is intelligence gathering in that sense, how do you ensure your scouts, so to speak, are both equipped and accountable? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, I guess I could jump in. I would just say, verify, verify, verify. I mean, I don't think for the most part, many of the journalists I know, I don't know if we have so many scouts as we used to so much. It's kind of a one-man show out there so many times, or one-woman show many times, where you're doing a story. Yes, of course, you have people who have experience in and may have done a previous story on it before, or you might have someone help you, check a fact, or so to speak. But the simplest answer is it's not easy. There are so many sources of information today that you really have to almost quadruple check anything you say anymore. And a lot of times, especially just for example, on the book I'm writing on residential schools, many times during the process over the past almost 2 years, I've literally had to stop in my tracks before I could go any further, because yes, I heard of a certain fact that existed, and a lot of people say that this fact exists, but I can't find a direct correlation anywhere. I can't find the piece of legislation that supposedly does exist that asserts this. So I would be stuck many times researching and researching and researching until I could literally find the original document back in history where the Department of the Interior said this in the report, and there it is, you know. So bottom line, it's not easy. And, you know, which is why I also say many times is just because someone says something in the news doesn't always necessarily make it true. You know, anyone as a reader is just as much of a journalist as we as journalists are, you know, because there's many times where someone have come back and said, well, this fact is this, and I've had to double check and been like, okay, that can be in addition to the story, or, you know, that's a perspective I didn't think, or, you know, it's bottom line, it's just not easy. You just have to be really, really careful because the sources of information are growing exponentially every single day. Chat GPT, you know, what a frightening concept to writers.
Yeah. I do think it's really hard. Go, Jourdan.
Well, as I say, I don't know, Vincent, I think as indigenous journalists, I think our job's safe.
Yeah.
I would say Vince is right, because you know, it's not only verifying, but also that paper trail, that documentation is important.
And a lot of people are trying to hide things, right? I mean, that's part of the, it's, you know, you are dealing with people who don't want those stories told, right? So, you know, because the easy journalism is doing this press release journalism. But, you know, because that's what people do want told. But how do you, you know, because Vince is absolutely right. This is, you know, any kind of investigative journalism is super hard work and it's labor intensive beyond belief. I would not make the claim that in PQ, where I work as an investigative journalist outlet, but when, like, any of you who do support investigative journalism, you know, how do you make those choices about what stories are actually, you know, where are you going to focus efforts in that direction?
Well, that's a tough question. It's I think it's a reason why so many different types of journalism exist, you know, because we have journalists all have something that we care about as a person, you know. You know, I was working with Jourdan and Mark, and, you know, Jourdan put her efforts out there to show people on a daily basis the number of COVID cases that existed, because it's something that she felt passionate about, and that evolved over time. Just like I find to be very, very important to cover things like, you know, Native American, Indigenous people in the media or television and TV, / films, you know, as a Rotten Tomatoes critic, things like that. We all care about something very deeply. You know, Mark Trahant for many, many years has done, you know, extensive efforts to cover the world of politics in Indian country, you know, because it's something that's very important. So how do we choose something? I think it just bottom line boils down to what we feel in our heart, what we feel passionate about. Because I think as a journalist, as much as you are delivering facts and figures and you know, digging things out of these dusty archives, is you also have to have passion for what you do. You know, I have a lot of passion for what I do, and I'd like to think that other journalists do as well. You know, so, you know, how we choose is how do you choose anything in life? How do you choose what you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? I think is the same level of question. You know what I mean? It's kind of like whatever sends you in that direction, what makes you wake up in the morning and go, all right, I'm ready to go once again, even though it's exhausting and tiring.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think it's a curatorial role, and you have to make some choices, though. And, you know, like if you're going to go into looking at inadequacies in the Indian Health Service, for example, or you know, there's a lot of different areas where you make a choice. This is going to be a focus area. But let me move on to the next question. Although if anyone wants to jump in, please. But here's a Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to jump in on that one because I know, I mean, it's essentially, so I'm part of the Indigenous Investigative Collective as a project of NAJA, and we did our investigation in 2021 into COVID deaths, if the Indian health system, if we would ever know it. Because like Vincent mentioned earlier, I started the COVID database for Indian country, and I soon started realizing, I don't know if we can, like, you know, with all these other factors of, you know, doctors identifying Native people as Hispanic or even just white or some other, you know, non-native person, I realized I don't think this is it. And I remember going into this meeting with Tristan Atone, so he works at GRIS now, but he came to us asking the same question, like, what do you guys, we're going to do something COVID related. What do you guys think? What have you been working on? What, you know, what's going on out there? And he asked the question. I think that's would be a really good one because I haven't seen much on it. And I told him, I've been wanting to do the story. I think we should, because the data shows we can't find anything. So I think it kind of also finds you in that moment. But, and like Schilling said, it was, you know, it's more of like that passion and asking yourself, like, who are the stakeholders, who's this going to impact, and who are we going to hold accountable in that too? Because that took a lot of FOIA requests.
Great, thanks. Really helpful. Another question that came down the pike from the audience. You know, so we operate, even if your politics might be anti-capitalist, we operate within a capitalist-dominated media framework, right? And you know, so how do you think about the political and economic analysis that grounds your reporting in journalism? You know, in terms of the stories you tell and how you tell them.
I think something that's interesting about that is that you know, if you look at community media, right, it has its place, but it's still outnumbered in that sense of the viewership that media conglomerates have. You know, CNN, Fox News, all it has millions and millions and millions of viewers. You know, and in that sense, community media needs to be more strategic, you know, in what it does, because it has ability to influence change, but social media is maybe more so the area where community media can champion this kind of effort, you know, because if you look at large media conglomerates versus small media, it's almost that sense of that, the story and analogy of David and Goliath, right? You know, and though Goliath is a formidable force, you know, with strategy and skill, David can still prevail. You know, and I think that's the story that we continue to see, especially in indigenous communities. I mean, look at, you know, what's happening today, and you know, these large conglomerates put out these stories, and if it's off or if it's wrong, boy, do they know about it immediately. So these massive powers that used to be the ones who control and disseminate all aspects of information are sitting on a very, very shaky foundation. People have to be very, very careful. So although it have once been all powerful, you know, many times what we're seeing is, wow, how the mighty have fallen, you know, more often than not. So though they may have this power that they used to have, I don't know if that really is the fact so much anymore.
Makes sense. Other folks want to jump in on that, like, sort of, you know, because you know, you can't be truly neutral, right? You're operating from a certain set of political economic assumptions, and how does that inform your journalism?
Yeah, at Shareable, I mean, I think we are really kind of rooted in our values, and you know, have very clear values that we wear in our sleeve, like I mentioned earlier. You know, recognizing that that every journalist, every reporter, every outlet has a point of view, and so, you know, our our kind of core values are empowerment, solidarity, collaboration, liberation, and joy. And knowing that joy part is a really key piece of the whole thing. That there is, I think there's going to be a session later this afternoon, evening around addressing burnout, and so there is a necessity to create space within our storytelling, but within the communities that we're working with, to come together, to experience joy, to collaborate, and to find a sense of belonging. And so it is a, values driven. I think that's the big thing. And whether you're using specific terms, I like to talk about everybody that's commenting without commenting, and there's somebody else on our staff, Robert Raymond, who's also with Upstream, has this saying, you're already a Marxist, you just don't know it yet. And so many of us and so many people are interacting within, with the general ethos, but without using specific terminology. And I think that it's important for us to not rely on that terminology and respect that people come to it and walk through this work in different ways.
Great, thanks. Lauren, you want to jump in at all on this?
I've just been enjoying everyone else's answers. Thanks, Tom, Jourdan, and Vincent. I work for a nonprofit news outlet, and our mission statement is to, bring voice to the voiceless and promote justice. Going back to that first question, with the economics, we're just lucky that all of our listeners and viewers and supporters believe in the same things that we do and are able to do so and work freely without having an editor, ask us to tone it down, don't use this particular language. We're going to call things what they are, and we're going to find those stories that, you're driving in your car and you don't want to get out because you have to hear how special this land back movement is. And these stories, kind of what Jourdan was saying, as much as we might seek things out, stories, as if you're a good journalist, will come to you. I'm not religious by any means, but sometimes there's like this spiritual connection when you find these stories, and it's just you're on the path to reporting these extremely important topics. And I know if you're a journalist and if you get into this career to get rich, then you're in the wrong job. It's a lot of heartfelt dedication, long nights, lots of research, and we do it to make this world a better place.
Okay, thanks.
Just like there used to be that book Zen of motorcycle maintenance, maybe there needs to be Zen of article writing, Lauren.
Exactly.
I remember that book.
Yeah.
Jourdan, do you want to say anything about sort of the assumptions that guide your work?
Oh, sorry, they're a little popping up. My fairness and reporting on the Indigenous world, because Native people are complicated. And I think that's what drives our work, because we see it. We see the conversations. It's really interesting. This is why I think I always tell reporters, you have to get out to the community and talk to people and just listen. Just listen to them, talk to them. No intention of a story, but just see what they're talking about, what they're up to, what's on their mind. Because the conversations you're hearing with those who run organizations versus those experiencing, what's happening and the repercussions of their of leadership, decisions, and what's happening online are all completely different. They're completely different. Everyone's saying on Native Twitter, this is what's happening. Everyone wants to be all radical. And then I'm like, have you talked to our community members? That's not what's happening, and that's not what they care about. So it's just really interesting to see, this gamut of opinions and voices and stances. but I think in all of it, we try when we go into a story is to be fair. Being fair, because people say there's always two sides to a story. There's always more than two sides to a story. I believe there's like 3, 4, 5. There's so many multiple points of views that need to be included in there, and we need to be fair.
Great, thanks. So another audience question, and this is for everyone. What suggestions do you have to help folks stay safe when talking about controversial topics? And the questioner is asking about safe from things like doxing or more overtly violent attacks from those who want to silence their messages.
Wow, I can speak on that, and I know Jourdan can too. We've had conversations. Yeah, oh yeah. We've had, when I was within the country today, Jourdan and myself and Mark Trahant and many of the editorial staff were having many conversations about, just these things, because we would report on stories where exactly these things happen. I have been doxxed. I have been given death threats. I have been, received personal phone calls at home. My address has been put out there. And, I remember one time literally meeting my wife's mother at a gas station. I think or just like, I don't know, running errands. I don't remember exactly what it was about. Just meeting up someplace, and she knocked on the window, and it was during one of these times, and I literally almost jumped out of my seat because I just was like, whoa, So it can be pretty scary sometimes to be a journalist that's fighting to tell the truth, what advice do I have for that is, I don't know. Honestly, is just to be very careful, be mindful of your surroundings. I grew up literally on Compton Boulevard in California. I lived in the streets of Gardena, Compton, Long Beach and the beach areas. And, I had a tough areas when I was young, but, and what do you do during those times? I was also in the military. What do you do during these times? You just be aware of your surroundings and be very, very cautious. Maybe change your telephone change your telephone number if you have to, other than just being very, very careful and very, very cautious, and just mindful of your surroundings. Sometimes as a journalist, it comes with the territory that some people are not going to like what you have to say, and I certainly can't speak for Jourdan. I can't speak for a woman. I'm a man, so it's a little different for me, I would imagine, very much so. But when you speak the truth, sometimes people aren't going to like it, and that is part of the job of being a journalist or a writer of any type, or someone who is popular on social media, or someone who speaks out. Perhaps Jourdan might have something else to add to that. I don't know if that's incredibly helpful, other than just be very, very mindful of where you are.
Yeah, I would say being vigilant. Whenever we go out, my mom's always sending me stuff, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Mom, if that happens in the parking lot or not, but she has a right to worry. I have a right to worry. I just say this is like really important to me, especially as a young Native woman, because our newsroom's also made up of we have a young staff, but also we have a staff made up of mostly women. So it's something that's very important to me. And we've always, I've encouraged them to, I keep a folder. And I label it FLAC. And anything I get, I throw it in there just to keep, if it raises like a huge red flag for me. I take it, to my CEO and our marketer at large to let them know. And if it's a real safety concern, making a police report helps. And also making a log too, has also helped quite a bit. And I mean, for the online stuff, it's really, like Vincent said, it's really difficult because I'm a millennial. I'm quick to the block button. I'm like, all right, bye. I don't care. I'm like, I care more about myself and my family than this troll who's like bugging me. I don't have energy for that. I have better things to do. Bunch of script. There's a folder of screenshots of them. And I think also too, with that social media and, being a young person, I've also had to be at least for me, be very strategic about when I post things. I've been trying to like not post live. Like it's really hard. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to do this because I'm at home. I'll show people what I'm doing. And then other times I'm like, nah, let me wait because I don't want people to know where I'm at. So it's, that's also a little bit difficult. So.
I think
Thanks.
one of the criteria, requirements to be a journalist is to be brave. Especially what we've seen unfold over the recent years where journalists are specifically targeted. I've definitely been in the field reporting when my friend and colleague who works for the BBC was particularly targeted by the police and shot by rubber bullets, even though media was, displayed all over his outfit. But the thing is, my friend got right back the next day, brave, crazy, maybe a combination of both. But that's what I personally believe. It's not right, but I understand that it is a part of my job, and I'm not going to live in fear of that. We, especially at KMUD, we don't really receive some of the threats that some of my colleagues here, other more national grassroots organizations are, but they still exist. And, we've had to double down on security. One of our sister stations in Wisconsin had a shooting. Someone walked in and, because they were a community station, it's very open to the public. Somebody walked in and killed multiple people. So here at KMUD, we've had to double down on security. We're not that, leave the doors open, come in as you please type of space anymore, because of what we've seen over the recent years. But big shout out to everyone here and all reporters. You're all incredibly brave and courageous.
Thanks. Tom, anything you want to throw in on this question? No? Okay.
No, yeah.
Let's move then to just sort of, we have to wrap up. We have about 3 minutes left on this session, but any steps you want to say that people who are attending this session, whether they're in nonprofits, philanthropy, movements in general, what can they do to support community-based media? And what does if community-based media has to support the movement, how can the movement support community-based media?
I'd like to say just real quickly, Steve, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this, and what an honor it was to be here along with Lauren, Tom, and Jourdan. And a special fond greeting to Jourdan. We've worked together for years, so we've had some pretty cool memories over the years of some pretty cool things we've done. But I wanted to say that support does not always mean writing a check, folks, or sending an online donation, because a lot of people worry, well, we don't have money or this or that. Support can be a retweet, or if you're a news organization, writing an article or opinion or editorial or about someone, or even personal words to a friend, support, shared, and it's important to remember as a nonprofit that many times nonprofits and philanthropic organizations and individuals can support the media organizations back. Thank you so much to Indian Country today, ICT. Thank you to you guys for helping us out, or doing a story on us. It goes both ways. Everyone can benefit from positive promotion and awareness and exposure. And in short, we can all work together to uplift each other. The media world can be tough, but it can also be a pretty wonderful place.
Thanks. Tom, you want to jump in here briefly?
Yes. Yeah, just very quickly dovetail on that. I think that we've got to show up for the publications that we believe in, and we need to help amplify those stories. And I think what was mentioned, those testimonials, those person-to-person sharing, that can be far more valuable than a $5 donation, although that $5 donation is also very much appreciated. But we're working to tell these stories because we feel there's a need for them. And if you feel there's a need for them as well, it's not a one-way street. It is a collaborative practice.
Great, thanks. Let's see, Jourdan.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm echoing what Vincent and Tom said. And also I think for the broadcast side, I mean, since ICT reaches, we're not on all the PBS channels, so people simply keep calling their station saying, hey, why isn't ICT on? Can we get it? Is also like a simple call, because that's also showing that we have a need for it.
Yeah, and who else? Lauren, right? Yeah, go for it.
Oh yeah, of course we're running out of time. Echoing, I completely agree with what everything said, and just know that decolonization is an achievable future. Support your local media, support the outlets you can trust. We're all in this together, and thank you.
Hey, thank you. And I was told we could go a little bit longer, but I think we are at the hour, so I want to respect people's time. And thanks to the audience for your questions. Hope we got to as many. We tried to get to as many as we could, and especially thanks to our panelists, Lauren Schmitt from KMUD. Tom Llewellyn from Shareable, Vincent Schilling from Native Viewpoint, and Jourdan Bennet-Begaye from ICT or Indian Country Today. It's really been an honor being with all of you today, and hope this moves the movement forward. So thanks so much.